Welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. This is the third video in our Feathered Star series. In the last video, you got some tips for choosing fabrics for this 52-inch star. Today, you'll learn some quick cutting techniques for making the feathers or the triangles that go around each star point. You can see that there's lots of feathers that need to be cut and sewn for this star. So come on in and let's get started. Before you start cutting fabric, you have to decide if you want squares in the corner or a set of triangles. I've decided to go with these C-squares in my quilt. Here's a sheet listing the cutting directions if you decide to use squares or without squares. In this scenario, you have to cut 8 4-inch squares, and then you need 16 triangles that eventually surround each one of these diamonds. There's also 32 pairs of light and dark triangles that go around these star points. If you decide to go with no squares, then you don't have to cut any C's. You will need 16 triangles to go around those diamonds and 40 pairs of light and dark triangles that'll go around each star point. Maybe seeing these layouts side by side will help you to decide to see or not to see. You'll find links to all these free handouts below. So for C, I need to cut 8 squares at 4 inches. I can trace around this template and then cut out those squares, or I can use my rotary equipment to cut a 4-inch strip and then cut 4-inch segments off of that. You'll be cutting lots of triangles for the feathers. These triangles will be 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches in the finished quilt. You could draw one out on graph paper like I did here, add 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around, and then make a template. Then you'll trace around this template on your fabric. Since you'll need almost 100 triangles, that's going to be quite the chore. No worries though. In the next section, you'll learn about a quicker cutting method. The feathers in this quilt are called half square triangles because when you sew 2 of these together, they form a square. So to make these triangles, you'll start with a square and then cut it in half. When figuring out the cutting size, you have to take into consideration the extra seam allowances needed in the center here. So I'll add a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch, and then these two in the center are a little less than a 1/4 inch. If I add all of these seam allowances up, I come to 7/8 of an inch. So what you need to remember is that you take the finished size, which is actually the shorter side. In this case, it's 3.5 inches, and then you add 7/8 of an inch to that. So you need to cut these squares 4 3/8 inches and then cut them on the diagonal. You'll end up with 16 of these half square triangles. Now you won't be using these to make these squares. Instead, 2 of these go around each one of these 8 diamonds. If you'd like more information about half square triangles, I've left some links below. The rest of these triangles that make up the feathers can be sewn in pairs to form a square. You could use that 7/8 of an inch rule to cut these out, or try another method. I like to add an inch to the finished size. It's much easier to calculate adding an inch rather than 7/8, and it gives me a little wiggle room to get back on track if my cutting and sewing get off. Finished size of this triangle is 3.5 inches. So I'll cut my squares at 4.5 inches. After cutting on the diagonal, I put right sides together and sewed a 1/4 inch seam. And then I'll press to the dark. Now this is a little bit bigger than what I need. So now I need to square this up to 4 inches. First, a word about pressing. Your accuracy depends not only on your cutting and sewing, but also on your pressing. So make sure not to skip this when making these feathers. I press this square rather quickly, and I can see that I've got like a little pleat here. And so I'll need to go back in and pull that over to get that press properly. If not, that'll throw off my accuracy. This unit had the same problem. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little pleat here that didn't get pressed properly. As a result, these 2 points don't match up. To get these points to match, I'll have to rip out that seam, repress, and then sew. So to avoid problems down the road, take care when cutting, sewing, and pressing. Locate the 45-degree line on your ruler and place that over that diagonal line on your piece. So let me move this up just a little bit. Let's see, I want to make sure that I've got a little extra over here to trim, and I see that and that, so I'm ready to trim. So I'll turn this around, take my diagonal line, get it lined up over the diagonal on my patchwork, and then I want to line up 4 inches here and 4 inches there. And when everything looks good, I'll cut. And here's a perfect square. Always make sure to check that the diagonal starts and ends in these corners. You want to avoid something that looks like this. The diagonal line ends about 1/8 of an inch down from the corner. If your square looks like this, you'll have to retrim to see if you can get that diagonal in the corner, or you'll just have to make a new set. Now here's a really fast method for making those half square triangles. It entails making grids like these and then sewing around them. You'll save time by sewing in one continuous seam and by cutting multiple units at once. You'll get 24 squares out of this grid and 8 squares out of this grid for a total of 32 squares that you'll need in this feathered star. If you're not using this C square, then you'll have to make 2 of these grids to get your 40 squares. If you look here on the cutting guide, you see that you need to cut a rectangle 13.5 inches by 18 inches. You'll need one of the dark and one of the light. On the back of one of them, you'll want to put this grid. I measured every 4.5 inches and made marks all the way around the edge. And now I'll connect those lines. I'm using this permanent marker so you can see. But I don't know if you can see that so well, so let's try a little bit thicker marker. After you get your 3 by 4 grid, then you want to mark these diagonals. And I'm going to go from that corner down to this corner, but my ruler doesn't reach that, so I can be confident if I just go to this diagonal, and then I'll move to the next one. So when I get down here, I want to turn and go in this direction. Then I'll turn and go in that direction. When my grid's been completed, put right sides together and pin between the drawn lines. And then stitch on both sides of the drawn diagonals. If you follow the arrows on this chart, you won't have to start and stop. You can stitch all the way down here, turn, and just keep stitching. And when you get to the end here, you just come back around and go backwards until you finish the entire piece. You do not have to stitch around these vertical and horizontal lines. Now this is a piece that I've used for demonstrating in other classes, but I thought I'd give you a quick look at how the sewing goes. So here's my line, and I come in. I just sew 1/4 inch over. And when I go through this intersection, I just keep on sewing. Notice where my pins are. I don't want them on any of those drawn lines. When I get to the end here, I just lift this up, pivot, and I continue around in that manner till I finish the entire piece. After everything's been sewn, you can cut on these vertical and horizontal lines. I've already cut one section out here. Now you can use your scissors Just go right through those intersections like so, or you can use your rotary cutter. You also need to cut those diagonal lines. If you keep everything together like this, you can go very quickly. So when you're finished cutting, you'll end up with 24 of these squares. Take them over to the ironing board, press to the dark, then you'll square them up to 4 inches. When it's time to square up, I like to lay out a number of squares with the diagonals all going in the same direction. Then I trim the 2 edges. I remove the scraps, then I turn all the squares so as to trim the last 2 edges. To me, this is the least favorite part of making this quilt. So instead of doing these all at once, I often take breaks in between. When you've completed all these units, either with C's or without C's, you're ready to go on to the next video. Yay, you made it! In video 4, you'll get some tips for cutting and sewing diamonds, along with directions for assembling these 4 corner units. Hope you stay tuned. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos with your friends. Remember, if you're trying to find us on the internet, type in LearnHowToQuilt.com. Don't forget the .com. Using the .com will get you right to our site.